I'm honored to present Dr. Maha Shaikh from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Maha will present the preliminary results of her study involving the analysis and understanding the total cost of ownership of open source software. So, Maha, you can begin.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know it wasn't on. Oh, so much for technology. Well, there's so much for my use of technology, not technology. Jan was talking about T-shirts at the end and about size, and I was just, this morning, well, my plan was to wear a proper suit, all right? Come and do this presentation in a very business-like style, in a suit and white shirt and all of that. And then everybody's so nice and casual, and I really like being casual because we at the LSE, at least, we're not a business school. We don't dress up. We dress down all the time. So I decided I would wear the T-shirt that you guys gave me for this conference because I thought that would be, you know, it's just that it's extra large, and I didn't realize I'm not quite there yet. I need another 10 years maybe to sort of grow into that size, but it grabbed my attention that I really wanted to sort of not wear a jumper or anything on top of this, but I think it looks terrible, and I am human after all. I don't want to look completely miserable, okay? So, but I do love your T-shirt. I'm just going to look for a size that actually fits me. Now, to give you some background, I'm going to give you an academic presentation, or mostly. I'm happy to have all sorts of questions thrown at me, and I will, of course, try and answer them to the best of my abilities. I have a PhD where my focus was open source software, but more particularly how open source communities learn and organize. And I was talking about community. And community, at the time where I started my PhD, it was not so clear-cut, or at least the analysis or the research hadn't quite come to the point where we understood that actually community members were, a large part of them were actually employees from companies. We sort of had this idea that most of them came from universities. And there were students who were doing this because this was part of their assignments, and so if it helped somebody else, that's fantastic. So that's where I started, and I moved on as a postdoc into the London School of Economics and then for, University of Limerick as well, working for Professor Brian Fitzgerald, and many of you who probably have ever read anything from the management literature, and actually software engineering as well, perhaps not. Professor Brian Fitzgerald is well known for his software engineering books, probably not specific to open source in the software engineering field, though. But I'm sure you're familiar with him. I worked with him for a number of years as well, while I was still finishing my PhD and beyond. And we looked at companies adopting open source and what was happening, why this phenomena was actually occurring. And now I was approached by the Open Forum Europe and the UK Cabinet Office, and this directly links into Bob's talk that you had, the first talk in the morning, which is about procurement and trying to make a difference in the UK government, because yes, it might be a race against different governments within Europe or beyond even as to who can be the most open, whether it's open standards or open source or open data. But it is definitely a move towards open, and I think the UK government's trying to play catch-up with countries like Spain and Italy and France and so many others. But I see that as a really good move, a genuine move, and it's very needed in the UK. I mean, the recession has hit the whole world, but the UK's economy is a lot shakier than I think sometimes it's written on paper. It would be really good to see more public sector adoption of open source, not to mention, of course, private companies. Now, this study was sort of, it's supposed to be a 4-month study. It's got a little delayed, but it's about a 4-month study, which is not a very long period of time by academic standards of research, or perhaps any standards of research. The aim was to be able to assess, is the total cost of ownership definitively always less or more expensive than proprietary? Now, any one of you who's ever had to do any research, or even just common sense, would probably tell you that's an impossibility to define, because every context, every culture, every company, and every sector is so different, their level of expertise is so different, that there's no way to actually say total cost of ownership will always be less for something or other. But what we can say is there are certain conditions which are really, really crucial before you can actually even think about lowering costs, or where will the cost actually could be lowered, perhaps down the line or earlier. So this is an evaluation of total cost of ownership, which is why my title actually talks about framing the conundrum. There's no total cost of ownership is a beautiful little phrase that companies use because it's so handy, isn't it? You know, what's the TCO? Great, let's get our matrix out and say, oh, so, you know, so many desktops, so many licenses, this is how much it's going to cost us. Some of these things are very easily quantifiable. And then, of course, there are other bits that are not so much. And I've realized that actually it's the benefits and the value that are that's really, really crucial that comes with open source. And that needs to be considered. But how do you actually put a monetary value to that? Because total cost of ownership, in most cases, actually is a value, right? You need to put a value to something. So that's the background. We've done, this is going to be, of course, a very academic-y presentation because I thought this would be a purely academic kind of a conference. So I will go through my methodology. I think if there are moments where, as Bob pointed out, I'm not English, as you probably can tell from the way I look, but I'm afraid I've lived in English for quite a while, so I've become quite English, so I might speak quite fast as well. Again, if I do, please stop me. Also, if there's anything that's not clear, if I'm speeding on about some topic that I'm assuming knowledge, I don't think that's probably true for this audience. I think I have more to learn from you guys than you do from me. So I don't think that'll happen. But if so, I don't mind if you stop me in between the presentation as well. All right, that's not a problem. I don't need all the questions at the end. So why is TCO a conundrum? Now, basically, I've gone through some of these ideas. I don't know if we can find the true cost of anything. I find that very problematic to be able to say that we can evaluate and put it to the very last penny that this is how much something is going to cost. That's a very tricky thing to do. There's always a round figure, and then how round is that figure at the end of the day? Putting a monetary value to everything is also not straightforward. I mean, interoperability, we try, and that's a very key issue when it comes to open source, or promoting open source along with open standards. How do you put a value to that? And leading on to that, of course, is the idea that, okay, there is a quantitative part. Licenses and things like that are slightly easier to quantify because other companies help us say, this is how much we're going to ask of you, so it's slightly easier. And then there's the qualitative benefits and the return on investment, which is slightly trickier. So that's the more qualitative side. You'll find that I start off trying to be very, very purely quantitative, but the second half of the presentation is going to go qualitative, and that, I think, is the strength of open source. There are so many beautiful things about open source that we can actually work with, and why companies, public sector and private sector, could get so much benefit from this. But when you're told, put a hard value to something, it makes it trickier sometimes because people's knowledge of open source, I mean, perhaps this is the wrong audience to say that, but outside in companies, and especially the public sector in some countries, especially the UK, knowledge about open source is actually not quite there yet. I mean, their level of expertise is fairly limited. And to be able to sort of justify why you should do open source is not easy. They have a number of complications that they talk about, and they're justified. I mean, they are real issues that they have to manage before they can move into open source. So how do we, as academics, companies, charities, or universities, or whatever, try and promote this if that's what we want to do? If we want to see a world that has more open of everything, and I use that in a way, I mean, I think open is a word that's been badly used in the world as well. And I don't mean in relation to open source, but I think it's been taken from open source, and everything is open. I was reading up something the other day, and they were talking about open courts, and open this, and open that, and it's like, that's very nice. I mean, but they take away the meaning of open. Open is becoming a meaningless word almost. So we've got to be careful about how we use this word open. Open source has a specific definition. Open court, I don't know, having court proceedings that are live and everybody can see them, or within reason, I mean, is that open? Is that necessarily in the same strain of open? Or maybe some people would say, well, I mean, perhaps some companies, for instance, would sort of say, well, anything that sort of promotes open is good. And it doesn't matter because it creates awareness. And again, it's your perspective, how you see the world, whether you see it on the more strong ideological side, or it's about having some sort of understanding and spread of ideas. And then, you know, you can have the evangelists, the ideologists, and the businesses, and on a mix of all of these things as well. But again, I just, when I use the word open, I'm trying to keep it slightly stricter to the definitional idea. And if otherwise, I will say so. Having done this study, I found that there were so many different understandings of total cost of ownership. Some were very, very, very tightly defined. And then a more recent study, and I find myself much, much closer to Lerner and Shankerman, a lot closer, because I think their definition is far broader for the TCO. Some of you may then argue, well, now we incorporate everything, so where is TCO going, really? You know, and maybe that's not what TCO is about. And I'm happy to really fend off questions like that if you have any, because it's nice sometimes. I mean, I teach, all right, and I like student input, and I think many of you sitting here are students, and it's fantastic how a student take on something usually changes my view on something I've been researching, and I think, you know, I'm reading all these amazing academics, my peers, these amazing geniuses, and then some really cool student will come along and point something out, and I think, good God, I never thought of that. And I haven't seen that written anywhere else. So I can then go and research it. So I really hope you'll be quite open about your questions. I don't believe there's anything called a stupid question. There's only stupid answers, and we tend to give them when we're standing up here rather than from there. So how does Lerner and Shankerman actually define TCO? As you can see, it's broader. They call it the total cost of providing a functionality of using one program. Now, that might be restricted, but you know, we can go beyond that. The proper accounting of costs should include total cost of procurement, management, and support, associated hardware costs, and when one is thinking of changing software solutions, migration costs as well. The one thing I don't think that they specifically point out here, and perhaps they feel that it's a part and parcel of all of this, is exit costs. And I'm going to come back to that, because do you see that the same thing as migration costs, or is that another form of cost? Because I'm going to give you my breakdown of the total cost of ownership, how it's been understood by other academics, and how my recent study sort of evolved it slightly, and how I think there are a few more categories, especially when it comes to open source. I think exit costs especially become extremely crucial, because proprietary software has I think, in general, okay, broadly speaking, a higher exit cost than open source, because open source on many occasions is based on open standards, and to move from one software to another within the open source field means that your exit costs can be low. Right? If, of course, managed well, and that becomes a migration cost issue as well. So how did we actually conduct this study? I know this is slightly crucial to me because, I mean, as you probably understand, how we conduct this study actually reflects on what we find. So our analysis and findings can be completely defunct if our methodology is not stringent and rigorous. So this study was done in two parts. The aim of this research is to understand the total cost of ownership. It's to better understand. It's not to come up with, you know, when it's higher or lower. I don't agree with that. But it's to better understand the total cost of ownership of open source, especially in the public sector. Of course, the UK Cabinet Office has sponsored this, partly sponsored this. So it's, and I think personally, if the public sector were to take up open source a little bit more strongly, it would actually have a far wider impact as well within the UK and beyond, which is, of course, the hope that open goes beyond. We're no longer just a country, we're all global. So that's the aim. How did we do this? There are two bits to this. I call it phase 1 and phase 2. We did a survey for phase 1. It's still open and it's still online, and anybody who has any desire to fill it out, I'm happy for them to go online. I can send you the URL. I'll send it through Christian. The survey has a set of 25 questions. This was a simple data gathering exercise to understand the main issues and challenges. So surveys are sometimes used. You send out a survey and you expect to get, I don't know, thousands of results, and you base your entire study on that. That was not our aim. It's not that I have anything against surveys. That was just not our focus for this survey. The point was to really see what's happening out there, because it's really difficult to gauge what companies are doing unless you go and speak to them, and they don't really give you access so easily, and that's going to come into my second part. It's slightly tricky, and when you talk to them about finance or security or quality issues or risk, oh my God, have you ever tried to do risk analysis in any company? Especially banks, security and risk in a bank, in an investment bank, if you ever want to do research connected to these ideas, good luck getting access, right? So there's certain things that it's not easy. Now, I've been very, very fortunate that Open Forum Europe have a number of really fantastic connections in the public sector and private companies, so access at the second level became slightly easier. But it's not always easy to get access. So the survey was basically to throw out some questions and see, what's everybody talking about when it comes to total cost of ownership? And then based on those results, we then formulated an interview guide, which again is an open-ended interview guide, a set of 10 questions, give or take a few, which we were then going to pose to stakeholders within companies and public sector organizations who really had a stake or had some sort of policy level understanding of why they had adopted open source software. I'm going to go through each I'll get into details of the methodology as I go through this. All right, so first going into phase 1. This survey's been online for 2 months. It's not a very long time, but considering we only have 4 months for this study, that's actually half of the time has already been spent just trying to collect surveys. It has 4 sections to this survey. The first one, of course, is the normal, what organization do you belong to, your contact details, so I can ensure that if I like what you've written, and when I say like, I don't mean that you were all pro-open source or hated open source, but the fact that you had some interesting comment to make, something that was challenging, something that was troubling you, or something that was contentious when it came to open source or TCO, then I really wanted to speak to you further so I could actually get a full detailed interview from you to actually understand, well, why did you say that? How is this challenging and how can we help? So that's when I say when I liked something, I don't mean it in just a bland sort of way that like it was just nice and they like open source. There was another very specific reason for Section 1 as well. Other than just grabbing details, that was our only way of ensuring some sort of filter as to who filled this out, because our initial desire was for this survey to send it out to very specific people and get results for them. That way, knowing that we're getting legitimate people, not people, and I'm not going to quote big companies, but some companies that perhaps don't like open source so much, to come in and try and fill out this survey online. So if they could do that anonymously, they would do that, and then we would get results that would be very skewed, perhaps against open source. Or, of course, on the opposite side, where you can get results that are very pro-open source, and again, that's not our aim. It's not to promote open source, it's to better understand it. Right? So again, to be absolutely clear, so the first part, the real aim for that was not only to get your requirements and your contacts that I can actually talk to you again, because access is an issue, but most importantly, to act as a filter. If I found anything that was anonymous or any contact detail that I could not find and I could not access, that survey was discounted. And it had to be, because anonymous results are just not going to be tolerated, because that can question all our results. So that was the point of Section 1, all right? And as many of you are probably doing research or hoping to, these are things that I think as I teach PhD students as well, so sometimes I get into this completely teaching methodology route, so shut me up when you want, but I think it's very, very important that you get your methodology right so nobody can kill your results. You don't want anybody killing your results, all right? Because you work very hard for them. Section 2 was to prompt the sort of open source that's being used by organizations and the time span. So are you into applications? Is it infrastructural use? And I'll show you some examples. But basically, it was to see, so what kind of open source are you really into? So how far along have you been just using this in your company for 6 months? Okay, that's great. You've probably got a lot to tell me about teething problems, but can you tell me at maturity level what happens in a company? Probably not so much, right? So that gave me an idea. Who did I want to focus on for the second level of my data collection, which is the interviews? I wanted a nice mix of companies and the public sector, but at different levels of maturity of use as well. Section 3 is asking for very specific details on strategic drivers. So why do you do it? Why do you go as a company? Why do you choose open source? So as you'll find out, many of them reduce vendor lock-in. And that's a cool word. All companies use it, and I think that's a very crucial reason to use open source, especially open standards as well, or more so perhaps for open standards. But it's not just vendor lock-in. There are other elements of vendor lock-in as well. And there are a number of other strategic drivers that companies pointed out. Some that were surprising, some not so much. And section 4 wants to list the TCO models used, basically, so what factors of the TCO were most crucial to you. So there's one that's a strategic driver, but the other is what cost factors came up that were challenging to you or problematic because you were actually having issues trying to create an equivalent for open source. Because, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, many things, when you buy software, for most companies, it's a software decision. It's not an open source decision. It's just a procurement decision. Happens to be open source sometimes. Can we really claim that there is something distinctive about open source adoption or open source TCO? And that as an academic is something that interests me. I don't know what you all think, but we always say that open source is so different. The development approach is completely different. But a number of researchers have worked on this, and I think you may remember a very, very old study by Kusumanu on Microsoft, and they actually realized, and it was more than one person, I forget the second author, I'm afraid, which is not good, but anyway, that Microsoft actually internally at the development level, not about the definition, not about the freedoms, not about the license, but the actual development methodology of how you actually work alongside your colleagues and how you share internally within a company, actually had a very hacker approach. Can't call it open source, but you can call it a hacker approach. So there are many different elements that we had to really think about as to when we were actually talking about open source. And now to give you some results of phase 1. Is that visible? I hope so. Now, this is snapshots, basically, all right? So there are going to be bits that I'm missing because I can't do that all in 45 minutes for you. In fact, 30 minutes, I'd like some time for questions as well. So the question here is that do companies and the public sector actually conduct a proper, full-scale TCO analysis before they actually adopt open source software? And the results say no. 72% actually don't. It's shocking. They just don't do it. Why not? Is it because TCO is not a consideration? Perhaps it's not a problem. Perhaps we as academics are making it a problem. I don't know. And so these are the questions that I really have been dealing with as to why isn't this done? Lerner and Shankerman's study actually across different countries, many different countries, actually indicated the same results. And our survey is on a much smaller scale than theirs. And I was very, very intrigued by the fact of the similarity. And of course, they come up with a number of different reasons as to why TCO studies are not done. Basically, they were studying SMEs. SMEs don't have the funds to do a TCO analysis. They just want to do something very, very quickly and very fast. And if they're cutting back on costs because they don't have the resources in the first place, they're not going to spend their very few resources on a TCO analysis. Now, what does that tell you about open source use and adoption? Do you take it up blindly? Yes. How effective is that? We don't know quite yet. All right? Now, which open source? This was another question. So which open source software saved your organization money? All right? So it wasn't that it can completely save it or not. So it was a scale, all right, as usual in most surveys. Applications. So you've got a number of different things listed there. It's not definitive and it's not exhaustive in any way. All right? So let me just say that now. What I found curious was the other category, right? You find the other category fairly large in a number of different questions that we asked. And this is what prompted me to change my interview guide for phase 2, right? And this is part of it. Then we said, are there relevant examples of some of these issues being changed in your organization? So we gave them a list of factors and told them to choose. And as you can see at the top, reducing vendor lock-in, they actually think, yes, there are real examples of this happening. We have reduced vendor lock-in now that we've gone open source. It doesn't say specifically to which application. You have to connect up each survey and know which application or whatever it is that actually has done that. Value for money comes in second, all right? And then you've got better adoption of open standards, which I thought was fantastic and is quite high up. Ability to experiment or innovate. Now, one thing I need to clarify, most of the surveys, for some reason, maybe public sector are too busy, but most of the surveys were filled out by companies, private companies. We had very few local authorities within the UK or beyond actually filling out the survey for us. So perhaps it's not so surprising when they talk about innovation, because companies have to be a little bit more risk-loving because your promotions are based on things like that as well. Ability to modify code, customization. Agility. So there are a number of different factors. The last one, well, before we come to the all other responses, is the ability to build and work with the peer community. Found that very intriguing. It's all the way down there. Why? Right? That's an issue, or maybe not. So now we're trying to build our cost categories, all right? So what type of cost? What's the importance of the cost category for each person that actually filled out the survey for their company or their local authority? Here, cost of the software. Just the cost of the software is the highest, right? Then you've got the cost of customization, which comes in a very, very close second. I mean, it's just a teeny weeny bit of a difference there. That's very crucial, cost of customization. Changing software. And I'm going to give you some examples from Transport for London, which is one of my case studies for my second level analysis. They've really gone into quite some detail about how customization and the need for agility were one of the key things that made them go open source. It wasn't the cost of the software for them. Cost of integration, cost, if you think about software scaling, cost of migration. Here we've got exit costs, and it's already beginning to show up in the survey. And upfront cost, cost of support, and cost of services. Again, all other responses are fairly large because people found that what we had written as categories in our survey were not enough. Of course, the other section had choices that you can write something. Some people did, and as surveys go, they want to finish something. And I have found, to my detriment, that 25 questions for a survey are far too long, okay? So you want to keep your survey probably between 10 and 15 questions if you're ever going to try and do something like that, if you already don't know that. I'm new to surveys. I do qualitative analysis mostly. So how easy was it to estimate this cost category for that company? Could they really put a figure to it? Remember the idea of putting a value to something? Well, the cost of software was easy, they thought. And it's quite, there's quite a big gap between that cost of maintenance. They think maintenance and upgrades are also fairly straightforward. Not so much, this was not so much evident from this, of my phase 2 of the study. But in the survey, people were very happy to put that as a second category. Cost of support was again easy. Cost of training. So you can see cost of customization now. It's actually down here. Now, I find that intriguing because I think on the slide previous to this, this was one of the most important categories of the cost, if you think about it, customization. And here, it's one of the hardest things that they can put a value to. Now, for me, who wanted to do interviews, this was really crucial. I thought, this is weird. They think it's really important, but they don't know how to estimate it. So that's quite intriguing about open source. So for the second part of my study, surveys are still going on, and we want to collect as many surveys as possible, even beyond just this study, because it would be a nice idea to keep TCO analysis going. Doesn't depend on being funded by the UK Cabinet Office in the sense that a report has to be generated. I'm a researcher, and I want to continue to do work on this. So the survey is still live. And what has it really helped us to do? It actually helped us to tease out the other category, all right, and a number of other issues. And it showed us overlap between different things and things that were not actually coming together very well. And one of the ideas was the customization one, which is why I pointed it out to you. What we have done is interviewed stakeholders involved in the public sector. Now here, because the survey was so skewed towards private companies, and I know that the UK Cabinet Office really wants to know of amazing cases from all of Europe, not just within UK, as to how the public sector was able to adopt open source. Now, we don't believe in only doing success stories, so we have some really interesting failure cases, and failure I use again in quotation marks, just like I would success, because nothing is fully a success or a failure, but that was very problematic and challenging. But what we can call maybe a failure of some kind is when that local authority or company had to revert back to proprietary software because they could not continue with open source for whatever reasons, all right? Now, so we have spoken to people in Spain, Belgium, UK, France, and Germany. But in this, tomorrow, when I get back into London, I have interviews set up with somebody in Spain, which is further work. Brazil by the end of this week as well. And Italy and Denmark are interviews spotted within this week and next week. This study should have been completed by the 1st of May. So as you can imagine, we are in a great hurry to try and speed this up and wrap it up as well. But interviews are still being set up with some of these people. it's interesting for us. We've done a lot of local work in the UK, and we've done a lot of telephone interviews across different countries. For me, personally, as a researcher, the aim is now to go visit some of these and do ethnographic studies and really sit in those public sectors and local authorities and visit them and speak to them and see how they actually work with open source on an everyday level. Really see what the real challenges are. But that's next. The interview guide, again, is a set of 10 questions, which change depending on how and who you interview, of course. And this relates to how TCO encourages the understanding of benefits, value, challenges, and lessons learned. We're going broader than just TCO. So what did we learn? Sorry, I'm conscious that I'm supposed to be finishing soon. So the first two categories of TCO, cost of operation and cost of software, is something, if you look at the different criteria below that, you'll have seen in most TCO analysis. They always show up. What I feel that we were able to sort of tease out, it's not, of course, mind-blowingly brand new. It's not that these categories haven't shown up, but we reframed them. That was part of our work, to look at cost of adoption and exit costs as something slightly different from how it's been understood for proprietary software. And I think these two categories is where open source is slightly distinctive. And this is what makes it interesting for me, right? For TCO analysis of open source, I found that these two categories were actually different. And I think we need to focus a little bit more. So under cost of software, for instance, initial purchase price, monetary cost, a set of customization expense, software scaling. These are things that you are all familiar with, and it's a software cost. Cost of operation, doing a formal TCO analysis, TCO policy, things like that. But under cost of adoption is learning. What are we learning? I mean, learning how to use a new software, a new interface, a new form of development. These are issues that really come up with first-time use of open source in the public sector, especially in the public sector, but also in companies. But learning in general, linking up to the idea of creating an ecosystem. You want a learned pool of people. We've heard Jan Winderberg talk about community building. We heard Mark Shuttleworth talk about community and community relevance as well. But when we talk about community, it's a really nice mix of employees from companies, but also people like us who are users. Now, I like to go beyond, because I think in yesterday's presentations in the morning, I felt that everybody was defining contributors and community purely from a very development perspective. You know, you contribute either as a bug fixer or using code, but not as me particularly, because maybe you are all software engineers. I'm not, all right? I'm a social scientist. I don't program. I have done software engineering in the past. Was not particularly good at it because I suck at maths big time, so that's not my strength. But I am a social scientist that likes to work on some interesting challenges from a highly theoretical point of view, right? And that's what I found is that the community is you and me as well. We use this software, we give it critical mass. If they don't have users who are laymen out there as well, they don't get the kind of critical mass they really need. So we are very, very crucial parts of this ecosystem. Interoperability, support services, training, access to upgrades. Now, we can go into, you can ask me questions on this. Maybe I'll just speed up a tiny bit, all right? Exit costs are very, very important. Switching costs from, as I mentioned before as well, from proprietary to open source, it's not straightforward. From open source to open source, fairly straightforward because you're based on open standards, all right? So some of the findings from the interviews that I thought you might like or you might enjoy, at least. What we did, of course, I just showed you that now. We slightly amended the understanding of TCO for open source. What I found really interesting was the lockout with open source. Now, we always talk about vendor lock-in for proprietary software. I'm not talking about vendor lockout. I'm talking about lockout of open source. Basically, a lot of companies are scared of open source. I thought, you know, it's called FUD many times. I like the idea that, you know, how do we change this into, you know, the vendor lock-in? Everybody says, you know, open source has very, very, you know, there's no vendor lock-in to open source. That's actually probably not so true either, unless we strictly talk about it in the sense of standards, because knowledge, expertise, know-how, experience causes different forms of lock-in as well, all right? But I changed that, and I thought, okay, let's call that lockout. Let's not call it lock-in, because that causes so much confusion in the terminology of what is lock-in. So I thought lockout was one way of saying it, because it locks companies in the public sector out. They're so fearful, they just feel, that's out for us. We're not going down that route. The temporal element of software adoption is really important as well, because the first phase of your adoption, maybe it's 6 months to 2 years, can be so tricky and challenging. If you don't make it work, and not in a high-profile way, especially for the big cases, like, let's say, the Munich case, or other very Extremadura is a fantastic example of how everything seemed to work very, very well. If it causes you problems, you have to go back to proprietary, or sometimes they do, and that can be a problem. But if you wait it out, you're going to get those benefits from open source, but they come further down the line. Can you wait? You know, are you realistic about when you're going to realize these benefits, all right, up front? The move in what really also intrigued me was some people within the public sector now talking about creativity, agility, and innovation. We're talking about the UK government, so I'm not saying anything, you know, deprecating about any other government, but the UK government, which surprised me a great deal, talking about innovation. We want to innovate. Now, public sector is notorious for not really being keen on innovation. Innovation is something, you know, for the private sector, we'll take it up when it's all stable and it works really well, because, you know, it's about giving value to our citizens, but not value for money, essentially, in the sense that, you know, budget is not the biggest concern. Of course, it is a concern, but it's not the biggest concern for the public sector. That is now changing. So we see perhaps a more privatized version of the public sector now. I don't know. All right, so some benefits. So this is what I was told. This is some of the benefits that they were getting from open source adoption. Now, again, we're talking about the public sector, which I think is really, really key. Greater flexibility, freedom, and control over the code, meaning they actually want to change it. It's not like many companies that take up the source code and they think, yeah, we're going to do open source, and they really never touch the source code. So does it make a difference to them whether they're doing open source or not? Some would say yes. Stallman would say yes, it still makes a difference, because it's still open source, and I agree to a great degree on that. On the other hand, many of us use open source, and sometimes I don't mean software techies like you guys, but you know, think about your grandma or your parents. Do they really care what software they're using as long as they can use it? You know, do they care if the source code is open? Building of in-house expertise and skills. This I thought was really, really nice for the public sector, actually thinking about retraining or training their staff based on open source. Who cares about that kind of training in the public sector usually? Allows pooling of resources, expertise, and code for reuse, customization, and change. They are. The Solihull example in the UK gives us great indication that they are becoming a house of expertise, that they now want to actually push across other local authorities within the UK and act as core experts. So they keep all the funds within that as well. So any other public sector authority that wants open source expertise is going to go to them and not to the private sector, which I think is really nice. So I think that's really nice for the public sector, considering so many jobs are being cut in the UK and probably elsewhere as well. Migration cost between open source products is lower, as open source is based on open standards. I've said that already quite a few times. And it builds a stronger and more expert local IT industry, all right? Now, we've heard many people talk about that. Jan spoke about that. Mark spoke about that yesterday as well, about trying to build a local industry. I think that's really nice, because you can then afford that kind of support and face-to-face value with people. I think that's very, very key. In the Extremadura case, we know that that was actually a really nice way to localize, not only in your language, but also in support and services as well. And that is now beginning to happen in the UK, but on a very, very much smaller scale. Now, this is really, really important for my report, okay, some lessons learned, because, you know, this is a report for the public sector, so you've got to give them these lessons, all right? So what can we learn from this, and how should we not make the same mistakes again? Within certain contexts and culture and background and all of that, keeping that in mind, some of these lessons that we have learned is that, like in the private sector, you need a very strong champion in the public sector as well for open source, or it's not going to work. And this person really does need to be top level. This whole beautiful bottom-up bubbling of open source, you know, not so real. Doesn't happen. You really do need somebody at the top level saying it. If we've got people like Bill McCluggage and so many other people at the top of the government in the UK saying, we are going to promote open source, and it's open standards and open source, that makes a difference. And it already has started to. Because so many things are based on innovation and risk when it comes to open source. And the issue is, public sector is not about taking risks. If you take a risk and it doesn't work, in the private sector, you're still sometimes thought of as this incredible rebel, you tried and it failed, but you have the chance to try again. In the public sector, you're out. So taking a risk is actually a serious problem for your career. You're fired. So, you know, you've got to weigh these things. But this mindset is beginning to change in the UK. Be clear on benefit realization. As I said before, when can you realize these benefits, and what benefits can you truly realize? What do people tell you you can, and what do you really think are realistic? If you're realistic, you're more likely to feel you're on track and things are going to go well, and you might stick with open source even 5 years down the line, which is what we hope for. Need a proper plan and IT strategy which doesn't foster false hope. Premature feelings of failure, this is really crucial. We've seen that in one of the particular case. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name this one because it didn't do so well, but it has moved back to proprietary software, and I'm talking about the UK. Didn't go so well. Very unrealistic strategy, very unrealistic ideas of what benefits that they were going to gain. Certification is needed for open source, and the procurement process as a whole also needs to be overhauled to level the playing field. That's again linking in with Bob's ideas of how procurement is a key issue as well for transparency. So these are some of the things that I thought were interesting to me, I'd like to continue to work on, and perhaps might intrigue you as well. How much code and expertise is actually being contributed back to the community? We know that even with the private companies, that doesn't happen so much, okay? Not all of them, but many of them. How about the local authorities? How about public sector? Promote pragmatism and not ideology. Now, that's something I have learned from other people. This is what I've heard over and over again. This is not my belief system. It could be, but it's not. I'm not promoting it that way today. This is what I've been told by the public sector and the private companies. It's all about, if it works, let's use it. That's it, all right? What model of engagement is being adopted by the public sector? Are they really being attracted by cost savings and then staying for the benefits, or is there another form of engagement? Do they know that the benefits will come later on? How do they engage with open source? Do they do it slowly, gradually, work with the community, work with their local authorities? How are they doing this level? What's the level of engagement and detail of it? And are healthy communities being sought and sustained? Now, this is part of my other research that I've been doing for the last 2 years, is the idea of a healthy community. This is both for the public sector and private sector. When you reach out to a community out there, how do you choose which community you want to work with? What are the indicators? What are the factors? Right? So I leave you with a wordle of the abstract that I sort of put up. I thought at least a little bit of color somewhere near the end. That's it, right?
Thank you, Maha.
Thank you.
Short questions, perhaps?
You know what we say in academia, if nobody asks a question, they were either bored to death or you didn't really tell them something that they understood. I wonder which one it is when nobody puts up a hand here. Or maybe it's both. It doesn't have to necessarily be one or the other.
Right, let me just say that Maha's survey and interviews or her study has actually been first one, as far as I know, that has dealt with that subject. As far as I know, yeah. Because, for instance, you would find, speaking to a vendor, the big vendors, software vendors like Microsoft, they might tell you, some consultants might tell you, wow, you know, having a Microsoft software in your firm or institution is altogether cheaper than having open source software and paying some consultants to or do the training, extra training or things like that. So I think that her studies actually will show the truth about those tricks that they play of something that we believe that it's quite self-obvious, like that having an open source software is in many ways better and cheaper in a sense of total cost of ownership, I believe. Yeah, one question there.
What are the tolerances you have to
somewhat agree.
But the third column was completely full of zeros.
Yes.
Which to me it sounds like all of them would be open source. None of them actually thought it cost them money.
No. That is exactly what we found in the survey, yes. Again, it's open to interpretation what that means because it depends on who's actually filling out the survey. Perhaps these were people who were very pro-open source or had worked very, very well, and they'd been the ones that had actually decided to go and fill out. With surveys, you always have issues like that. It depends on who fills it out. So under those kind of conditions, the larger the number of people that actually fill out your surveys, you can even out some of those differences. I didn't point that out, but this survey, we're only expecting very, very small results, and I say very small. I mean, we basically had, I think it was close to 45 results, some of which we had to discount as well because they were anonymous. So we had test cases, or people only filled out half the survey. And if it didn't fill out section 3 and 4, again, we felt that it was better not to accept their results. So there's a number of issues here, which you have with all surveys, and it's a good thing that you pointed it out, but I think that's more a condition of who filled it out rather than purely indicative of open source always saving money and never failing.